The Dakota Territory was a place that didn't know mercy. For Elara Hayes, a widow living on the edge of nothing, survival was a battle fought every single day. But one evening, she finds a man dying in the dust near her homestead. He's a Lakota scout, gut shot and bleeding out. Helping him is a death sentence. Leaving him is inhuman. She makes her choice, but she doesn't know who he is or who is hunting him. The answer comes at dawn, when a dozen warriors appear at her door, their faces like stone. This isn't a simple story of rescue. It's a story of betrayal, impossible choices, and a reckoning that would stain the prairie red. The dust was the first thing and the last. It was the color of forgotten bones, and it coated Elara Hayes' world in a shroud of fine, choking powder. It silted the windowsill, gritty against her fingers. It soured the water in the barrel. It was, she often thought, the physical manifestation of her grief for her husband, John, an ever-present grit in her throat. John Hayes had been dead for 14 months. Cholera, the trader from Absolution Creek had said, though Elara suspected it was just bad water from the long journey. He'd lasted just long enough to raise the cabin's frame and dig the root cellar. The rest, the chinking, the sod roof, the meager fence for her 3 chickens and a mule, had been her work. Hayes' Creek was a cruel name for a place where the creek itself had dried to a cracked, muddy ribbon 3 months prior. Elara's homestead was an island in a sea of emptiness, 5 miles from her nearest neighbor, Silas Croft, and 20 miles from the cluster of saloons and lean-tos called Absolution Creek. She was alone, and the land knew it. On this evening, the sun was a dying ember, hemorrhaging reds and purples into the bruised sky. The air was still, amplifying the scritch-scritch of a loose shingle on the roof. Elara carried her husband's Winchester, its stock smooth and familiar against her shoulder. It was time for her nightly perimeter check. She walked the line of her failing corn patch, the stalks brittle as skeletons. She checked the mule's tether and scattered the last of her chicken feed. The silence was heavy, not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath. That's when she heard it. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't the wind. It was a cough, a wet, guttural sound that was swallowed almost immediately by the dusk. Elara froze. Her knuckles turned white on the rifle. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sounding small and foolish. Only the wind answered. She moved slowly, stepping over the brittle remains of a barbed wire fence John had started. She walked toward the dry creek bed, the Arroyo Seco. And she saw him. He was sprawled face down in the dust, half hidden by a clump of rabbit brush. He was Lakota. He wore hide leggings and a simple breechcloth, his chest bare and slick with something dark. He was young, perhaps 20, his black hair matted with blood and alkali dust. She nudged him with her boot, a groan. He was alive. With strength born of panic, she rolled him over. The wound was horrific, a gaping, ragged hole in his gut, low on the right side. It wasn't an arrow, it was a bullet, a heavy caliber one, and it had been fired at close range. He was burning with fever, his skin radiating heat even as the desert night turned cold. Elara's mind raced. The rules of the territory were simple and brutal. An Indian on her land was a threat. A wounded Indian was a lure, a piece of bait for whatever had wounded him. The cavalry patrol, which passed by once a month, was clear. Do not engage, do not assist, fire a warning shot and ride for the settlement. Ride 20 miles, on a mule in the dark. Suicide. Fire a warning shot. It would bring his hunters right to her door. She looked at his face, contorted in a mask of silent agony. He was just a boy. He was dying. He looked, for a fleeting, terrible moment, like her younger brother, Thomas, who had died on the crossing. "Damn it all," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. "Damn you for this." She couldn't leave him. It was a weakness in her, a stubborn piece of the Ohio Valley girl she had been, a piece John's practicality had never managed to scour away. Leaving him to be torn apart by coyotes, or worse, found by his enemies, was a sin the dust couldn't cover. She looked at her cabin, at her root cellar. The cellar was dug into the slight rise behind the house. Its door was a thick, slanted plank of oak, covered in sod. It was hidden. It was defensible. It was also where she kept her food. "All right," she said to the dying man, her voice shaking. "All right, but you make one sound, and I swear to God I'll use this rifle, you understand?" His eyes fluttered open. They were black, depthless, and consumed by pain. He didn't understand her words, but he understood the rifle leveled at his chest. He gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Gritting her teeth against the stench of blood and impending death, Elara Hayes grabbed the Lakota scout under his arms. She began to drag him, inch by painful inch, across the dust toward her home, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Every scrape of his body on the hardpan ground felt like a nail being hammered into her own coffin. She had just invited the apocalypse into her root cellar. The root cellar was small, smelling of damp earth, curing onions, and the faint, sweet decay of a forgotten potato. Elara lit a single tallow candle, its flame a weak, trembling star in the oppressive dark. She had dragged him onto a collection of empty burlap sacks in the far corner, as far as possible from her precious jars of pickled beans and smoked jerky. He was fading. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. The wound was a nightmare. She knew, with the grim certainty of a homesteader, that it was mortal. The bullet had torn through his bowels. There was nothing to be done but manage the pain and wait for the fever to take him. But that weakness, that Ohio stubbornness, wouldn't let her just watch. She fetched her doctoring box. It held little more than a bottle of laudanum, a few rolls of clean linen from her wedding trousseau, and a jar of yarrow salve. "Water," she said, holding a dipper to his lips. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. He choked, coughed, and his eyes snapped open, focused. He looked at her, not as a savior, but as a confusing, terrifying new element in his final hours. "Who did this?" Elara asked, more to herself than to him. She gently pressed a damp cloth to the edge of the wound. He flinched, his body rigid. His hand, slick with his own blood, shot out and gripped her wrist. It wasn't a strong grip, but it was desperate. He stared at her, his black eyes boring into hers, trying to communicate the one thing he had left. "Nick," he whispered, the words dissolving into a pained Lakota phrase she couldn't understand. "I don't know," she said, trying to pull her arm away. "I don't understand." He held tighter. He was trying to warn her. He took a gasping, shuddering breath and tried again, pushing the English word from his lungs with the last of his strength. Thorn. The name hit Elara like a physical blow. Elias Thorn. Everyone in Absolution Creek knew Thorn. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't a prospector. He was a businessman. He owned the Lucky Spade, the biggest saloon in the settlement. He owned the freight company. He held the mortgage on half the homesteads in the county. And he ran a private, brutal security force of 15 men, ex-scalp hunters and Confederate bushwhackers, who kept the peace. Thorn was the man who bought buffalo hides by the thousand, long after the great herds were gone, and no one asked where he got them. He was the man who sold whiskey to the tribes on treaty land, then hired his men to protect the settlers from the violence he himself had fomented. Elias Thorne was a predator who saw the territory not as a home, but as a carcass to be stripped, and this Lakota scout had crossed him. "Thorne," Elara repeated, her blood running cold. This changed everything. This wasn't a tribal skirmish. This was white business. If Thorne's men found this scout on her land, they wouldn't just kill him. They would kill her for being a witness, for being a loose end. They would burn the cabin to the ground, and the dust would swallow the ashes. The scout's hand fell away from her wrist. He had delivered his message. His eyes closed, and he slipped back into the delirium. Elara sat back on her heels, the candle flame dancing in her wide eyes. The cellar suddenly felt like a tomb. She was harboring the one man who could bring Elias Thorne's wrath down on her head. She gave him a heavy dose of laudanum, more to quiet him than to save him. He sank into a drugged stupor. She spent the rest of the night in the rocking chair John had built, the Winchester across her lap, facing the door. She didn't sleep. She listened to the mule shifting in its lean-to. She listened to the scritch-scritch of the shingle, and she listened to the ragged, fading breaths coming from beneath her feet. She had to decide. When the sun rose, she could ride for Absolution Creek and tell Sheriff Brody. But Brody was a drunk who owed Thorne money. That was no help. She could put the scout on her mule and try to take him where? The reservation at Standing Rock was 100 miles north. He'd be dead in an hour. Or she could do the unthinkable. She could end his suffering herself. One clean shot. Bury him deep. No one would ever know. She was contemplating this final, terrible option when the first hint of grey light touched the horizon. And with the light came the sound. At first she thought it was the wind, a low, resonant thrumming. But it grew. It became the unmistakable, ground-shaking rhythm of dozens of horses, not the sloppy, chaotic clatter of a white posse, but the disciplined, unified beat of warriors. Elara's heart seized. She ran to the small, grime-caked window. They were there, lining the low ridge that marked the eastern edge of her property. They weren't the vibrant, painted warriors of dime store novels. They were grim, pragmatic. A dozen of them, sitting motionless on their ponies, their breath pluming in the cold dawn air. They were armed with rifles, not bows. They stared at her cabin, their forms silhouetted against the bloody sunrise. They had come for their man. The title she had seen on a pamphlet back east, a story of a brave settler woman, flashed in her mind with hideous irony. At sunrise, warriors gathered at her door. This wasn't a story. This was a reckoning. One rider, taller than the rest, his hair bound in otter skin, nudged his horse forward. He began the slow, deliberate descent toward her home. Elara Hayes checked the load in her Winchester, her hands slick with sweat, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was so cold it stung her lungs. Elara stood on the porch, the rifle held low, not aimed, but ready. She could feel the cellar door beneath her feet, a subtle vibration, as if the man below could sense his kin. The lead rider stopped 30 yards from the porch. He was a man in his late 20s, with a face that looked carved from hard-weathered rock. He had a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, puckering the skin. He raised one hand, palm out. It was not a gesture of peace, but a command. "Wait." He said nothing. He simply looked. He looked at the cabin, at the mule, at the chicken coop, and then his eyes settled on Elara. They were dark, intelligent, and held an exhaustion that mirrored her own. Behind him, the other warriors fanned out, a silent, disciplined crescent. They were cutting off all escape. "I have no food to spare," Ilara said, her voice dry and cracking. "No whiskey, no bullets. You have to leave." The leader tilted his head, as if listening to a distant sound. He spoke, not to her, but to the warrior beside him, a sharp string of Lakota. Then he looked back at Ilara. He spoke in halting, broken English. "We, not food, we look. Man." He pointed to the ground, then made a walking motion with his fingers. "Man. Our man." Ilara's heart was a hammer against her ribs. This was the moment. The lie. "There's no one here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just me. I've seen no one, not for weeks." The warrior's eyes narrowed. He dismounted, a fluid, powerful movement. He handed his reins to the man beside him and began to walk toward the house. He wasn't asking permission. "You stay back," Ilara said, raising the rifle a few inches. "This is my land, my property. You stay back." He stopped, 10 yards away. He looked at the rifle, then back at her face. He seemed almost disappointed. He pointed. Not at her, but at the ground by the porch steps. Ilara's eyes followed his finger, a dark, plum-colored stain, a single damning smear of blood on the hardpan, where she had paused to catch her breath while dragging him. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't seen it in the dark. The warrior's face hardened. He barked a command. 2 of his men dismounted, their rifles now leveled at her. "Stop," the leader said. He was scanning the ground, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the faint tracks, the scrape marks of a body being dragged, leading directly to the root cellar. He pointed at the slanted cellar door. In ground. "He's sick," Ilara said, desperation creeping in. "He's dying. I tried to help." The warrior locked eyes with her. His were filled with a cold, piercing rage. He thought she had done it. He thought she had shot him and dragged him into her cellar to finish him off. He took another step, and then, from beneath the earth, came the sound. A low, agonized groan. The laudanum was wearing off. The man in her cellar was awake, and he could hear the voices of his people. The lead warrior froze. His entire demeanor changed. The anger was replaced by a sharp, sudden shock. He listened again, his head cocked. "Matto," he whispered, the name sharp as an arrow. From the cellar, a muffled, pained cry. "Andrew!" The leader, Andrew, stared at Ilara, his face a mask of disbelief. He strode forward, pushing the barrel of her Winchester aside as if it were a twig. "Open! Now!" Ilara's hands fumbled with the heavy iron latch. She pulled the sod-covered door open. The smell of damp earth and blood wafted out. Andrew peered into the darkness. He saw the figure huddled on the burlap sacks. He turned to Ilara, his eyes blazing. "You help?" "I found him. Last night, in the arroyo," Ilara said, the words tumbling out. "He was like this. I gave him water. Laudanum." Andrew stared at her for a long, unreadable moment. He issued a command. 2 men rushed past him into the cellar. One was older, carrying a large medicine pouch. This must be the Nick, the medicine man, the scout had tried to name. Andrew did not go in. He stayed on the porch, his eyes fixed on Ilara. He was the guard. He was the judge. "He is Matto," Andrew said, his voice low and heavy. "My brother." The twist of the knife. She hadn't just saved a random scout. She had saved the brother of the war party's leader. "He's dying, Andrew," Ilara said softly. "The wound. It's too deep. Not die." "Here," Andrew said, his jaw tight. "He not die in white man's hole." The medicine man emerged from the cellar, his face grim. He spoke rapid Lakota to Andrew, gesturing to his own gut, then shaking his head. The news was bad. Andrew's shoulders slumped, A barely perceptible movement. The leader's mask slipped, revealing the brother's grief. He looked back at Ilara, his suspicion returning, now laced with a new, pragmatic question. "You, alone," he stated. "Why? Why help?" Ilara faltered. How to explain? He was dying, the dust. It takes everything. I couldn't let it take him. Not like that. Andrew considered this. He didn't understand her sentimentality, but he understood the result. She had given his brother a few more hours. She had given him a sip of water. She had hidden him. From whom? "Who?" Andrew asked, his voice a low growl. "Who? Gun." Ilara took a deep breath. She had been their prisoner. Now, she was their only witness. "He said a name," she replied. "He said Thorn." The reaction was instantaneous. Andrew's hand flashed to the knife on his belt. The other warriors, hearing the name, let out a low, collective murmur of hatred. They didn't just know the name. They knew this enemy. "Elias Thorn," Andrew repeated, the name tasting like poison. He spat in the dust. "Thorn, Makaska." White-skinned cur. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than suspicion. It was a cold, calculating respect. She was no longer just a white woman. She was the enemy of his enemy. "Thorn, come," Andrew said. It wasn't a question. "He come. Finish." "Yes," Ilara whispered. "He'll come back. He'll track him here." Andrew looked at the sun, now cresting the ridge. He looked at his brother, too weak to move. He looked at the cabin, a pitiful fortification in a wide open valley. "We stay," Andrew declared. "We wait for Thorn." Ilara realized her situation had just flipped. The warriors were no longer at her door. They were inside her home, and they weren't just waiting for their man to die. They were setting a trap. Her homestead was about to become a war zone. The homestead transformed. Andrew was a born commander. He didn't ask Ilara, he directed her. His men, a dozen disciplined warriors, moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency. Two men took the horses and Ilara's mule into a hidden box canyon 1/2 mile away, a place Ilara hadn't even known existed. They brushed away their tracks with sage branches. 4 warriors, the best riflemen, took up positions, not in the cabin, as Ilara expected, but outside it. One climbed onto the sod roof, vanishing, lying flat. 2 more settled into the dry arroyo, the very place she had found Matto, using the banks as a natural trench. The 4th disappeared into the skeletal remains of her corn patch. They were visible if you knew where to look, but Thorn's men would be riding in fast, arrogant. They wouldn't be looking. Andrew, Ilara, and the medicine man, Nick, remained in the cabin. The cellar door was closed but not latched, a strip of blanket stuffed in the jamb to silence any creak. Matto was now in Andrew's care. Nick worked over him, applying a poultice of chewed herbs and mud to the wound. It was ritual as much as medicine. He chanted, a low, rhythmic sound that filled the small cabin, a counter-rhythm to the scritch-scritch of the shingle outside. Ilara found herself, a prisoner, in her own kitchen, sitting at the small pine table John had built. Andrew stood by the window, motionless, a sentinel watching the eastern ridge. Hunt, Andrew said, breaking the silence. Ilara looked up. "Thorn?" "Yes, Thorn. He break treaty, cross river. He build firehouse." Ilara frowned. "A firehouse? House for rock. Dig rock. Make noise. Boom. A mine," Ilara breathed. "Thorn is mining in the Black Hills, on your land. It was illegal. It was an act of war. The Lakota held the Pahar Sapa as sacred. Matto? Find. Matto. Watch," Andrew continued, his English clipped. He draw. Map. Show. Bluecoats. Show. Laramie. Matto wasn't just a scout. He was an intelligence agent, gathering evidence to bring against Thorn. Thorn, catch him. Matto, run. Many bullets. He, ride. Here. Now Elara understood. Matto wasn't just a random victim. He was a witness carrying evidence that could destroy Thorn's operation. Thorn had to find him. He had to get that map. The map, Elara said. Did you find it? Andrew tapped his own chest. Safe. Nick. Find. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. Elara was, by every law she knew, a traitor. She was harboring hostile natives, conspiring against a white man. A powerful one. But looking at Andrew and hearing the pained, fading breaths from the cellar, she felt no loyalty to Elias Thorn. She felt only a cold dread and a strange, brittle kinship with the men in her home. They were all defending something. Andrew looked at her, his gaze analytical. You, good gun? He nodded at the Winchester resting against the wall. I can hit what I aim at, Elara said. Good. You, stay. Window. This window. He pointed to the small attic window, a square hole cut in the northern gable. See, barn. See, road. Thorn won't come from the road, Elara said. He'll come from the arroyo, same as Matto. No, Andrew said with certainty. Think, Matto. Alone. Hurt. He think, you, alone. Scared. He ride, front door. Kick, take. He, lazy. He, white. The casual sting of the last word hung in the air. Elara chose to ignore it. He was right. Thorn was arrogant. He would expect to find a terrified widow and a dead Indian. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on the sod roof, turning the cabin into an oven. The air was thick with the smell of Nick's herbs, sweat and fear. Elara climbed the rickety ladder to the small attic space. It was suffocatingly hot, the air filled with dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light. But the view was perfect. She could see the faint trace of the wagon road from Absolution Creek and the wide, desolate expanse to the east. She waited. She watched her land, the land she had fought for, become a chessboard. The pieces were set. The Lakota were hidden. All that was missing was the enemy. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows began to stretch and the heat had baked all moisture from her mouth, a new sound came. Not the rhythmic beat of warriors, but the jangling, sloppy cadence of a large group of riders. Elara's heart hammered. She squinted into the sun's glare, a dust cloud, a big one, and then a rider. But it wasn't a group. It was a single man riding a familiar-looking bay mare. He wasn't riding fast. He was ambling, casual. Elara's breath caught. She knew that rider. She knew that slouch. It wasn't Elias Thorn. It was her neighbor, Silas Croft. Silas Croft. A widower like her. His homestead was 5 miles east, a failing cattle operation. He was a thin, reedy man with pale eyes and a perpetual stoop. He had been neighborly since John died. Too neighborly. He'd stop by once a week, unannounced, usually with a stringy piece of jerky or some news from town. He was always offering to help, to fix her fence, to plow her field. Elara had always refused. There was a grasping neediness to Silas, a thin, wheedling quality she mistrusted. She scrambled down the ladder. "A rider!" she hissed to Andrew. "One man, my neighbor, Silas Croft." Andrew's face darkened. "Neighbor? Friend?" "No, not a friend. Just a neighbor." See, us? I don't know. He's just riding in, casual-like." "Tell him, go," Andrew commanded. He and Nick grabbed their rifles and melted into the shadows of the cabin, one on each side of the door, invisible. "Tell him, sick. Tell cholera. Go, fast." Elara nodded, her mind racing. Cholera. A smart lie. It was the one thing that would make a man turn his horse and not look back. She stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. She tried to look annoyed, not terrified. Silas rode up, stopping just short of the porch. He didn't dismount. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a dry drawl. He touched the brim of his dusty hat. "Just checking on you. Saw some commotion from my ridge. Looked like a dust-up." Ilara's heart skipped. He had been watching. "It's nothing, Silas. Just the wind. I'm not feeling well. I think I ate some bad pork." Silas's pale eyes didn't leave her face. He smiled, a thin, tight-lipped expression that never reached his eyes. "Bad pork? That's a shame." He sniffed the air. "Smells peculiar. Like herbs and something else." He was close. Too close. "It's a poultice, Silas. I might have the cholera. My stomach is cramping, bad. You should go. You don't want to catch it." This, finally, seemed to land. Silas's smile wavered. He backed his horse up a step. "Cholera, you say? Well, now that's terrible, Ilara. Terrible." He was about to turn his horse. He was leaving. Ilara felt a wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. And then Silas's eyes drifted from her face, down to the porch boards by her feet. He stopped, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had been standing, right over the cellar door. On the planking was a single, fresh, dark red drop of blood. It must have dripped from the blanket she'd used to wipe her hands. Silas looked at the blood. He looked at the cellar door. He looked at the wagon tracks near the barn, tracks that were not hers. He looked at the blood smear on the ground that Andrew had seen, the one she'd had no time to scrub. His gaze returned to her face. The weak, wheedling man was gone. In his place was someone cold, sharp, and calculating. "You're a poor liar, Ilara," Silas Croft said softly, his voice losing its drawl. He dismounted, pushing past her before she could react. He didn't draw his pistol. He just walked into her cabin. "Silas, get out!" "Where is he?" Silas asked, his eyes scanning the small room. He saw the empty laudanum bottle. He saw the bloody rags in the basin. The Indian. The one Thorn wounded. Ilara's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Silas laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "I've been Thorn's eyes out here for a year, Ilara. I watch the patrols, I watch the hostiles, and I watch you. Thorn pays me good money for information, and the information that you're harboring, his most wanted, well, that's a bonus." The betrayal was so complete, so mundane, it left her breathless. He wasn't a neighbor. He was a spy. You've been waiting, Ilara realized. Waiting for me to fail, so you and Thorn could take my land. Thorn gets the land. I get a finder's fee. And maybe, he said, his pale eyes crawling over her, I get the widow. He took a step toward her. "Get out," Ilara whispered. "It's over, Ilara. Thorn's main group is 10 minutes behind me. I just rode ahead to confirm. He's going to be so pleased. Now where is he? The cellar?" He took a step toward the cellar door. "I wouldn't," a new voice said. Silas froze. Andrew stepped from the shadows, his rifle aimed not at Silas's head, but at his gut. Nick emerged on the other side, his knife in his hand. Silas Croft's face turned the color of ash. He raised his hand slowly, his thin smile gone, replaced by the slack-jawed terror of a rat caught in a trap. "Well," Silas stammered, "looks, I misjudged the situation." "Yes," Andrew said, his English clear and cold. "You did." Outside, a distant shout. Ilara ran to the window. The dust cloud she had seen before was no longer a cloud. It was a mass of riders. 15, maybe 20, fanned out in a battle line, charging hard for the cabin. At their head was a large man on a black stallion, a buffalo hide coat on his back despite the heat. Elias Thorne had arrived. "He is bait," Andrew said, nodding at Silas. He barked a command. Nick grabbed Silas, bound his hands with a strip of leather, and gagged him with one of Ilara's dishcloths. "Get to attic," Andrew ordered Ilara. "Now, fight or die." Ilara grabbed her Winchester and scrambled up the ladder, her heart pounding, a frantic, terrifying drum. The siege had begun. The world outside the attic window exploded. Thorne and his men, a rough collection of hired guns and bar-sweeping loyalists, didn't slow down. They rode in like a wave, whooping and firing their pistols at the cabin, expecting to flush a single terrified woman. The crack of the first shot didn't come from the cabin. It came from the corn patch, a warrior Ilara hadn't even seen, nicknamed Hawk Nose by her in her mind, rose from the dust. His rifle barked. One of Thorne's lead riders threw his arms wide and toppled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. The charging line faltered. Chaos. "Ambush!" Thorne bellowed, his voice a great roar. "Spread out! Circle 'em!" But it was too late. The trap was sprung. From the arroyo, the two Lakota rifles opened up. Crack, crack. Two more horses went down, screaming, pinning their riders. From the roof, a fourth rifle. Whoomp, a man clutching his chest. Thorne's charge had dissolved into a panicked scramble for cover. His men, now dismounted, dove behind the water trough, the woodpile, and the shallow ditch by the road. "In the house!" Thorne roared, firing his heavy-caliber Sharps rifle at the main window. Glass shattered. "They're in the house!" Ilara, perched in the attic, felt her whole world shake. Bullets thunked into the sod walls, harmless, but the sound was deafening. She rested her Winchester on the windowsill. She was shaking so badly she could hardly see. "Hit what you aim at." John's voice. She saw a man, a big, bearded man, trying to dash from the woodpile to the cover of the barn. She led him, just as John had taught her with rabbits. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man spun and fell, his leg buckling under him. He screamed, a high, thin sound. She hadn't killed him, but she had anchored him. "Good." "Shot," Andrew's voice came from below. He was by the main window, firing, moving, firing again. He was a ghost. The battle settled into a siege. It was no longer a charge. It was a lethal game of inches. Thorne's men were pinned. Andrew's warriors were invisible. "Silas!" Thorne roared, his voice raw with fury. "Croft, you damn snake, this was not the deal. Where are you?" From inside the cabin, Nick dragged the bound and gagged Silas Croft to the shattered window. He held his long knife to Silas's throat. Andrew shouted, his voice carrying over the sporadic gunfire. "Thorne, you, leave! You, go, or... friend, die!" There was a long silence. Thorne, crouching behind the water trough, peered at the house. He saw Silas, his eyes white with terror. Thorne laughed. It was a cold, brutal sound. "That snake? You can have him, you red devil! He ain't worth the bullets!" Silas's muffled screams were pitiful. Andrew looked at Nick and nodded. It was a cold, pragmatic decision. The bait was useless. Nick pulled Silas back from the window. Ilara heard a choked, wet sound, and then a heavy thud. She closed her eyes, bile rising in her throat. The neighbor was gone. The cost of betrayal was absolute. Now, angry, Andrew said, as if stating the weather. He was right. Thorne, realizing his inside man was dead, and his prey was not only armed but allied, changed tactics. "Burn 'em out!" Thorne bellowed. "To the barn! Get the kindling! Burn the sod busters out!" Ilara's heart stopped. The barn. Her barn. It was full of dry hay. "No," she whispered. From her attic perch, she saw two of Thorne's men, crouching low, making a break for the barn. "The barn!" she shrieked down to Andrew. "Two men running to the barn!" She fired, missed, fired again. The man on the left yelped and clutched his arm. But they kept going. They tumbled inside the barn doors. The warrior on the roof, hawk nose, had a clean shot. His rifle cracked. One of the men in the barn screamed, a short, cut-off cry. But the other one was still in there. A minute later, a terrible smell, smoke, a flicker of orange, and then the whole side of the barn whooshed into flame. The wind, which had been still all day, picked up, blowing from the west, blowing from the barn directly toward the cabin. Sparks and burning embers, carried on the superheated air, began to rain down on the cabin's sod roof. The man in the corn patch, seeing the new threat, broke cover. He ran toward the house, firing as he went, trying to draw their attention. Thorne's men cut him down in a hail of lead. He fell 20 yards from the porch. 4 warriors left. The heat was becoming unbearable. The smoke was acrid, burning Ilara's eyes. "They're burning us!" she choked, scrambling down the ladder. The cabin was filled with smoke. Andrew was at the back door, peering out. The back was clear, for now. "We go," he said. "We can't," Ilara cried. "They're out there, and Matto." As if summoned, a terrible, wet coughing sound came from the cellar. Nick threw open the door. The smoke was pouring down into the hole, suffocating the dying man. Matto was conscious. He was sitting up, his face a grey mask of sweat and agony, but his eyes were clear. He looked at his brother, Andrew. He began to speak, his voice a rattling gasp. It was a long string of Lakota. He was giving an order. He was angry. Andrew argued, his voice sharp with grief. Matto shouted, a desperate, fading sound. He grabbed Nick's arm and pulled him close. He was pointing at his own medicine pouch, then at the wall, then at the fire. Nick's eyes went wide. He looked at Andrew and he nodded. Matto, his duty done, sagged back. He looked at Ilara, who was standing, stunned, by the ladder. He raised one hand, his palm out, a gesture of thanks, a farewell. "What is it?" Ilara asked Andrew. "What did he say?" The side of the cabin groaned as a burning timber from the barn fell against it. The fire was spreading. The house was catching. "He says, go," Andrew said, his voice thick. He grabbed Ilara's arm. "We run, now! We're not leaving him! He is warrior," Andrew said, his pride and his pain warring in his face. "He fights! His last fight!" Andrew dragged her to the back door. Nick and the other remaining warrior were already there, rifles ready. "Run for Arroyo," Andrew commanded. "Run, and do not look back." He kicked the back door open. "Now." They burst from the cabin, Ilara in their midst. The air was cool and clean. Shouts from Thorne's men. "There they go! Round the back!" Gunfire erupted. Dirt kicked up at Ilara's feet. She ran, clutching her empty rifle, sobbing for breath, running toward the dry creek bed. She, Andrew, and Nick dove over the bank, tumbling into the sand. The third warrior fell, shot through the back, his body rolling to a stop just short of the ledge. 3 left. Thorne, seeing his prey escaping, rose from behind the water trough. "Get 'em!" he roared, striding toward the cabin. "They're trapped in the ditch. Finish it!" He and his remaining 5 men advanced on the arroyo, firing as they walked. "It's over, woman!" Thorne yelled. "It's over, you red filth!" He kicked open the front door of the cabin, which was now filling with thick, black smoke. He strode inside, triumphant, ready to claim his prize, to find the map. Andrew grabbed Ilara and pushed her down, covering her body with his own. He looked back at the burning cabin, his face a mask of terrible, final grief. "Matto," he whispered. And then Ilara understood. Matto wasn't just a scout. He billed Firehouse. Make noise. Boom! Thorn's mine. Matto hadn't just stolen a map. He had stolen dynamite. Elara screamed, a fraction of a second before the world ended. Whump! Boom! The cabin didn't just burn, it detonated. The force of the explosion was apocalyptic. The roof, the walls, the very foundation burst outward in a blossom of fire, splintered wood, and superheated earth. The shockwave hit them like a solid fist, throwing dirt and debris over them in the arroyo. Elias Thorne and the 5 men following him were at ground zero. They didn't even have time to scream. They were vaporized, their triumph turned to ash in a microsecond. The sound echoed off the ridges, a profound, deafening boom that silenced the territory for miles. Then, silence. A terrible, ringing silence, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the sudden, panicked whinnying of distant horses. Elara, Andrew, and Nick, covered in dirt, slowly rose from the ditch. The homestead was gone. The cabin, the barn, everything. A smoking, burning crater was all that remained of Elara's life. Matto was gone. Thorne was gone. The reckoning was complete. The smoke from the crater rose in a thick, black column, a funeral pyre for 12 men and 1 woman's life. The sun was setting, painting the smoke in an obscene, beautiful palette of orange and violet. Elara stood, numb. Her hands were raw, her dress was singed. She looked at the smoking hole where her kitchen had been, her rocking chair, her table, the quilt John's mother had made. All of it. Ash. Andrew and Nick were already moving. They were salvaging what they could, not from the fire, but from their fallen. They collected the rifles and ammunition from their 2 dead warriors near the arroyo. They scalped no one. This was not about trophies. It was about supply. Andrew approached Elara. He held out her Winchester. "We got go," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The victory was ashes in his mouth. "Go," Elara repeated, her voice hollow. "Go where? This, death," Andrew said, gesturing to the crater. "Thorne, men, come, from town. They hunt you." He was right. The explosion would be a beacon. The rest of Thorne's organization in Absolution Creek, Sheriff Brody, the respectable folk, they would ride out. And when they found the bodies of white men and the tracks of Lakota, they would find Elara. And they would hang her. She was a race traitor. She had sided with the hostiles. She was as guilty as any of them. Her old life was not just gone. It was a trap. "I can't," she whispered. "Where would I go?" "With us," Nick said. It was the first time he had spoken to her. His English was better than Andrew's. "For a time, you are Wingyang Wachang Tognyaka." "What does that mean?" "Woman of the good heart," Andrew translated. "Matto, say this. Before, end. Say thank you." Tears, hot and sudden, finally came. They cut clean paths through the soot on her face. Nick retrieved the hidden horses. They mounted. Elara put on her mule. The 2 surviving warriors, Elara Hayes, and the body of their fallen comrade, slung over a horse, rode north, away from the burning ruin, as the last light of day died. They rode all night, pushing north into the broken country toward the Black Hills. Elara rode in a stupor, her mind a blank slate of shock. They stopped at dawn in a high, hidden canyon with a small spring. Nick built a smokeless fire. They ate dry jerky, not Elara's but their own. They buried their 2 warriors there, in a high crevice, covering them with stones. They sang a low, keening death song. Elara stood apart, a solitary witness, the only one left from her side of the battle. Andrew approached her as she stared east, back toward the life she had lost. He was holding a small, oiled leather pouch. "From Matto," he said. Elara opened it. Inside was not money, It was not a trinket. It was a map. A crude, hand-drawn map on a piece of tanned hide. It showed the rivers, the main forks, and the ridges. There was a large X, drawn in charcoal. "Thorn's Mine," she read, the letters awkward. "Yes," Andrew said. Boom, house. But this is boom." He pointed to the map. Matto had not just marked the mine. He had marked the dynamite caches. He had marked the weak points. He had, Elara realized, drawn a complete plan for its destruction. Matto's final sacrifice wasn't just to save them. It was to ensure his real mission, the destruction of Thorn's Mine, could be completed by his brother. But there was another mark on the map, a small circle far to the northwest, away from the mine, away from everything. 3 wavy lines were drawn in it. "What's this?" Elara asked. "Water," Andrew said. Find a spring, good, valley, hidden, safe." Matto hadn't just been a scout. He had been a seeker, looking for a new home for his people, away from the reservations, away from the white man's roads. "This for Lakota," Andrew said, pointing to the mine. "Revenge." Then he pointed to the spring. "This for you." Elara looked at him, stunned. "For me. You. No. Home. You. No. People. You. Like us. Hunted. This map is life. New life. For you." He was giving her the one thing Matto had found that wasn't part of the war. He was giving her a future. I can't," Elara said. I wouldn't know." "You learn," Andrew said. "You strong. You survive the dust." He was giving her a choice. She could ride with them, be an outcast among them until they tired of her. Or she could take this map, this one kernel of hope, and start again. Truly, utterly alone. "I will take the map," Elara said, her voice firm, the numbness replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They rode together for 2 more days, north and west, until they reached the high plains. Andrew pointed. "Spring, that way, 2 suns." He pointed east. "Reservation, that way, 5 suns." He pointed south. "Your town, 10 suns and death." "And you?" she asked. Andrew looked at the map in his hand, the copy of the mine's location. His eyes were hard. "We finish Matto's fight." He and Nick turned their horses. They did not say goodbye. They simply left. Elara Hayes sat on her mule, alone on the high plains, with a leather map, a rifle, and a new, terrible freedom. Months later, a trapper moving through an uncharted valley in the far northwest territory would report a strange sight. A thin plume of smoke, a half-built cabin made of fresh-cut pine, and a solitary woman, her face weathered as leather, skinning a deer with a Lakota knife. He called out, but she simply raised her Winchester. He left her alone. Elara Hayes, the woman of the good heart, was building her new world, one log at a time, in a land of new dust and clean water. She found a man dying in the dust, and in saving him, she lost everything she had. But Elara Hayes' story isn't one of loss. It's a story of brutal transformation. She was stripped of her home, her past, and her people, and was forced to see that the lines between civilized and savage were a lie, drawn in the dust by men like Elias Thorne. The real Wild West wasn't about heroes and villains. It was about survival. It was about impossible choices and the devastating consequences that followed. Matto, the Lakota scout, sacrificed himself not just for his people, but for the stranger who showed him a moment of kindness. And Elara, in return, had to become something new, a solitary figure, beholden to no one, surviving on her own terms. What do you think of Elara's choice? Was it bravery or was it the only option she had left? Stories like this, of betrayal and unlikely alliances, are the true heart of the West. If you want to hear more true-life stories of grit, survival, and karma, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. And please, share this with someone who needs to hear a tale of true resilience.